there is a precise, invisible line drawn across the atmosphere of our planet. Below it, life flourishes. Above it, at 8,000 meters, life begins to expire. This is the death zone, a place where the human body does not just struggle. It actively begins to consume itself. To step into this realm is to enter a biological countdown, where every breath is a borrowed luxury and every decision carries the weight of mortality. We often hear stories of the sudden, violent ends on Mount Everest, the avalanches, the falls, the terrifying storms. But there is a silent killer, far more insidious, that waits until the moment of triumph is over. It waits until the adrenaline fades, until the summit photos are taken, and the climber believes the worst is behind them. On May 23, 2024, amidst one of the busiest and most controversial climbing seasons in history, a 37-year-old Nepali climber named Binod Babu Bastakoti stood on top of the world. He had achieved what thousands dream of and what many die trying to reach. He looked down upon the clouds, a conqueror of the mother goddess of the earth. He had survived the ascent. He had navigated the treacherous Khumbu icefall, the silence of the western Khwam, and the sheer terror of the Lhot's face. But the tragedy of Everest is that the summit is only the halfway point. As seasoned mountaineers often warn, getting up is optional, getting down is mandatory. And for Binod, the descent would not lead to celebration in Kathmandu, but to a lonely, freezing end at the very edge of salvation. His story is not one of recklessness, but a chilling case study of how quickly the human physiology can collapse under the crushing reality of high altitude. He didn't fall into a crevasse. He wasn't swept away by wind. He made it back to the perceived safety of Camp 4, the highest camp on the mountain. Yet it was there, surrounded by tents and potential rescue, that the lights went out. How does a strong, determined man succumb to the air itself? What happens inside the brain and lungs when the body decides it can no longer function? In this episode, we are going to dissect the harrowing final hours of Binod Babu Bastakoti. We will strip away the romance of mountaineering to look at the cold, hard science of altitude sickness and the psychological trap of the summit. This is a story about the fragility of life at 29,000 feet. If you are drawn to these deep, analytical dives into the extremes of human survival and the mysteries of the natural world, please take a moment to subscribe to Ben's Stories. Your support allows us to continue documenting these important, cautionary tales. Now, let us return to the morning of May 23rd, and the thin, lethal air of the Himalayas. To understand the fate of Binod Babu Bastakoti, we must first strip away the westernized caricature of Everest climbers. Often, media portrays the mountain as a playground for wealthy foreign tourists guided by superhuman Sherpas who are immune to the cold. But Binod did not fit either stereotype. He was a 37-year-old Nepali national, a man of the mountains by birthright, climbing with the agency Yeti Mountain Adventure. He was not a high-altitude porter working for a paycheck. He was an aspirant, a man seeking the same glory and personal conquest that draws dentists from New York and lawyers from London. This distinction is crucial because it reminds us that altitude does not discriminate based on passport or heritage. Biology is the only currency that matters in the stratosphere, and on May 23, 2024, the exchange rate was brutal. The 2024 climbing season was already shaping up to be a grim chapter in Himalayan history. The slopes were crowded, the weather windows were tight, and the traffic jams at the Hillary Step were becoming notorious once again. In this chaotic environment, Binod was just one moving speck in a long line of parkas, inching upward. To the casual observer, he looked strong. He moved with purpose. But inside his body, a silent, catastrophic war was already being waged. This brings us to the true antagonist of our story. It wasn't a storm, it wasn't an avalanche, and it wasn't a slip of the boot. The enemy was the air itself, or rather, the lack of it. To comprehend what Binod faced, we have to look at the death zone through a medical lens rather than a romantic one. We often hear the term thrown around in documentaries, but the physiological reality is terrifyingly specific. At sea level, the air we breathe is roughly 21% oxygen. Our bodies are calibrated to this pressure. Our hemoglobin acts like a fleet of trucks efficiently transporting oxygen from our lungs to our brain and muscles. But as you ascend past 8,000 meters, roughly 26,000 feet, the atmospheric pressure drops so drastically that the effective oxygen availability is slashed by 2/3. Imagine trying to run a marathon while breathing through a narrow straw. Now, imagine that every cell in your body is slowly suffocating. This is the baseline existence in the death zone. The human body is not designed to survive here. It is only capable of dying slowly. From the moment a climber leaves Camp 4 at the South Col to begin their summit push, they are on a biological timer. The body enters a state of catabolism. It literally begins to consume its own muscle tissue for energy. The digestive system shuts down because the body cannot spare the blood flow to process food. The blood itself thickens. To compensate for the lack of oxygen, the body produces more red blood cells, turning the blood into a sludge that resembles motor oil more than vital fluid. This thick blood struggles to circulate, increasing the risk of frostbite and heart attacks, placing an immense strain on a heart that is already beating at a sprinter's pace just to keep the climber moving at a slow crawl. But the most insidious threats are the edemas. High-altitude cerebral edema, HACE, and high-altitude pulmonary edema. These are the specters that haunt the dreams of every expedition doctor. HACE is essentially drowning on dry land. The blood vessels in the lungs constrict so tightly in an attempt to retain pressure that they begin to leak fluid. The climber's lungs fill with their own blood and plasma. You can hear it, a wet, crackling sound in the chest, a cough that brings up pink, frothy sputum. Then there is HACE, the likely culprit in the confusion that often leads to tragedy. This is where the brain swells. The skull is a fixed container. It cannot expand. So when the brain swells due to the leakage of fluid from oxygen-starved vessels, it gets crushed against the bone. The symptoms are terrifyingly subtle at first. A bit of clumsiness, a slight slur in speech, a headache that no ibuprofen can touch. But it rapidly devolves into ataxia, the loss of bodily control. Climbers suffering from HACE often act drunk. They cannot walk a straight line. They become irrational. They might unclip from the safety rope because they believe they are in a garden at home. They forget where they are. They forget that they are dying. This was the invisible minefield Binod Babu Bastakoti walked into. And like so many before him, he was likely blinded by the psychological phenomenon known as summit fever. It is a potent cocktail of adrenaline, hypoxia, and the sunk cost fallacy. A climber invests months of training, weeks of acclimatization, and tens of thousands of dollars to get to this point. When the summit is just a few hundred meters away, the rational part of the brain, the part that says, "I don't feel right, I should turn back," is silenced. The hypoxia essentially lobotomizes the climber's judgment. It whispers a dangerous lie. You are fine. You are almost there. Just a few more steps. We must also consider the specific pressures of the 2024 season. The cue when hundreds of climbers are clipped into a single fixed line. You cannot simply move at your own pace. You are forced to wait. You stand still in the freezing cold, burning precious oxygen from your tank, while the person in front of you struggles over a rock step. Every minute spent standing still at 8,500 meters is a minute of life expectancy shaved off. We don't know the exact minute-by-minute physiological state of Binod as he ascended, but we know the generic profile of a climber in his position. He was likely exhausted, dehydrated, and running on sheer willpower. The tragedy of the death zone is that it masks symptoms until it is too late. You can feel strong on the ascent. The adrenaline of the goal masks the headache. The excitement of the view masks the fluid accumulating in the lungs. It is often only when the summit is reached, and the adrenaline crashes, that the body presents the bill for the debt incurred. Binod reached the summit. He stood at the pinnacle of the world. For a few glorious minutes he was higher than any other human being on the planet who wasn't in an airplane. He had conquered the mountain, but the mountain is patient. It knows that the climb is only half the journey. The summit is a trap. It lures you in, exhausts your reserves, and then demands the hardest physical effort of your life. The descent when you have nothing left to give. As Binod turned his back on the summit to begin his journey down towards Camp 4, the trap snapped shut. The setup was complete. He had entered the domain of the enemy. He had pushed his body past the red line, and he had used up his reserves. The death zone does not forgive. It does not bargain. And as we will see, it strikes with devastating speed when the victim believes they are heading towards safety. The invisible enemy was no longer just around him. It was inside him, in his lungs, in his blood, and in the swelling tissues of his brain. The descent is where the real horror story begins. The descent from the summit of Mount Everest is often described by survivors not as a journey, but as a hallucination. The euphoria of the peak evaporates almost instantly, replaced by a crushing, monolithic fatigue. For Binod Babu Bastakoti, turning his back on the summit of the world marked the beginning of the most dangerous commute on Earth. The time for celebration was over. The time for survival had begun. To understand the specific tragedy of his death, we must analyze the timeline of an Everest descent. It is a race against three dwindling resources: sunlight, oxygen, and body heat. As Binod navigated his way back towards the Hillary Step, the famous 40-foot rock face that guards the summit, his body was already operating in a deficit. Every step down requires a bizarre mix of physical braking and mental acuity. You are not just walking. You are constantly catching yourself from falling. With every step, the quadriceps fire to stabilize the body, burning glycogen that simply isn't there. The descent is where the invisible enemy we spoke of earlier changes its tactics. On the way up, the enemy is resistance gravity, pulling you back. On the way down, the enemy is momentum and complacency. Statistics tell us that the majority of accidents happen on the descent. Why? Because the goal has been achieved. The brain, flooded with dopamine from the summit's success, relaxes its guard. It is a biological trick. The climber feels a sense of completion, but they are still deep within the death zone. As Binod moved past the south summit, crossing the knife-edge ridge where the ground falls away for thousands of feet on either side, he was likely entering the final stages of severe hypoxia. Even with supplemental oxygen, at this altitude, the blood oxygen saturation can drop to levels that would put a hospital patient in the ICU. The brain begins to stutter. Time becomes elastic. Minutes stretch into hours, and hours compress into seconds. This is the gray zone where decision-making fails. Did he check his oxygen gauge? Did he remember to drink water? At this stage, simple tasks require monumental effort. The turning point in Binod's story is particularly haunting because, by all traditional metrics, he was succeeding. He did not collapse on the Corniche Traverse. He did not freeze on the balcony. He navigated the technical sections with the skill of a man who knew the mountains. He kept moving. In the world of high altitude, mountaineering, movement is life. As long as you are moving, you are generating heat, you are circulating blood, you are alive. Late in the day, the tents of Camp 4 appeared in the distance. To a climber descending from the summit, Camp 4 looks like heaven. Located on the South Col, a flat wind-swept saddle between Everest and Lhotse at 7,906 meters, it is a desolate wasteland of rock and ice. It is littered with shredded tents, empty oxygen bottles, and the frozen waste of decades of expeditions. But to Binod, those bright yellow and orange dots meant safety. They meant water. They meant a sleeping bag. And this is where the narrative takes its darkest turn. This is the point of no return. Binod Babu Bastakoti reached Camp 4. He survived the climb. He survived the descent. He unclipped from the fixed ropes and stumbled into the camp. In most adventure movies, this is the end of the danger. The protagonist collapses into the tent, exhausted but safe. But reality on Everest is not a movie. The moment a climber stops moving at extreme altitude after a summit push is the most critical physiological moment of the entire expedition. This is the post-exercise peril. While moving, the skeletal muscle pump helps return blood to the heart and keeps blood pressure up. When a climber suddenly stops, lays down, and relaxes, the cardiovascular system can undergo a catastrophic crash. The adrenaline that was keeping the heart pumping hard suddenly withdraws. The blood pressure plummets. Witnesses and reports from the mountain indicate that Binod's condition deteriorated with shocking rapidity upon his arrival at the camp. One moment he was a functioning climber, the next he was a medical emergency in a place where medicine effectively does not exist. This suggests that he had likely been suffering from a developing high-altitude cerebral edema, HACE during the descent, masked by the sheer force of his will to get back to camp. Imagine the scene inside the tent at Camp 4. The wind is howling outside. The South Col is a wind tunnel, funneling gales that sound like freight trains. Inside, the air is still thin, barely breathable. Binod likely lay down, thinking he just needed to rest. But as he lay there, the fluid in his brain continued to accumulate. The pressure inside his skull rose. The tragedy of dying at Camp 4 is the tragedy of proximity. You are surrounded by other people. There are other teams, other Sherpas, other climbers. But at 8,000 meters, every person is fighting their own battle for survival. There is very little surplus energy to care for others. This is the brutal economics of the death zone. A rescue from Camp 4 requires a team of 6 to 8 fresh, strong Sherpas to carry a person down. But everyone at Camp 4 is either exhausted from their own summit push, or saving their energy for one. As the sun dipped below the horizon on May 23rd, plunging the mountain into the deep freeze of night, Binod was in the grip of the final breakdown. His body, having cannibalized its own reserves to get him back to the safety of the tents, simply had nothing left to give. The turning point was not a dramatic fall from a cliff. It was a quiet, internal switch being flipped. The heart, strained beyond measure, swimming in thick, sludge-like blood, facing the immense pressure of the lungs filling with fluid, began to falter. The horror of this specific turning point lies in the false hope. He had made it back, he was supposed to be safe. But the death zone does not respect the boundaries of a campsite. The air inside the tent at Camp 4 is just as lethal as the air on the summit. The altitude sickness caught up with him not on the exposed ridges, but in the perceived sanctuary of the camp. It is a chilling reminder that until you are below the frost line, until you are breathing thick air, the mountain still has its claws in you. Binod's journey ended not with a bang, but with a fade. The systems shut down one by one. The confusion of haste likely drifted into a coma, a final mercy that shielded him from the terror of his reality. He was a conqueror who died in the castle he had just seized. The turning point was a paradox. He walked himself to death, and the moment he stopped walking to save himself was the moment he died. There is a specific, haunting quiet that descends upon the human mind in the final stages of hypothermia and hypoxia. Outside the tent, the wind at the South Col might be screaming at 50 miles per hour, battering the nylon walls with the violence of a hurricane. But inside the mind of the dying climber, the storm begins to recede. It is replaced by a strange, narcotic calm. This is the ultimate deception of the death zone. It kills you by making you feel comfortable. We must now confront the most disturbing aspect of Binod Babu Bastakoti's death, and indeed, of almost every death that occurs on the high slopes of Everest. It is not the physical pain, but the profound existential isolation. Binod died at Camp 4. He was not alone in a crevasse. He was not lost in a whiteout on the Kunchang face. He was surrounded by other human beings. Within a radius of 50 meters, there were likely dozens of other climbers, Sherpas, and guides, huddled in their own sleeping bags, boiling water, and gasping for air. And yet, he was completely, utterly alone. This brings us to the morale dilemma of the death zone, a place where civilized ethics evaporate and are replaced by a primal lizard brain logic. At sea level, if a man collapses in a room full of people, the moral imperative is immediate. You help. You call 911. You perform CPR. But at 7,900 meters, the rules of humanity change. The altitude creates a moral vacuum. Why? Because every single person at Camp 4 is essentially a drowning victim fighting to keep their own nose above water. To ask a climber at this altitude to save another is like asking a drowning man to hold up a lead weight. The tragedy of Binod's end is the proximity of help that was rendered useless by physics. We can imagine the scene. Other climbers nearby may have known he was in distress. But in the death zone, empathy is a luxury the brain cannot afford. The frontal lobe, the seat of judgment, emotion, and empathy, is the first to suffer when oxygen levels drop. Climbers often report a zombie-like state of detachment. They see a body, they see distress, and they register it not as a tragedy, but as an obstacle or a neutral fact. There is a man dying. The thought ends there. There is no energy for the follow-up thought. I should help him. This biological apathy is the true horror of Everest. It strips us of our humanity before it strips us of our lives. It forces us to ask a terrifying question. Is our morality biological? Is our compassion dependent on oxygen pressure? The evidence from the mountain suggests that kindness is a function of physiology. When the oxygen goes, the kindness goes. Binod lay in his tent, likely slipping in and out of consciousness, while just a few feet away, life went on. Tea was brewed. Oxygen regulators were checked. The mundane business of survival continued in the face of his extinction. As the HACE high-altitude cerebral edema progressed, Binod's reality would have begun to fracture. We must look at the psychological horror of what was happening inside his skull. As the brain swells and crushes against the cranium, the firing of neurons becomes erratic. This leads to profound hallucinations. Survivors of near-death experiences at high altitude often report the third-man factor, the overwhelming sensation that there is someone else with them, a benevolent presence guiding them, or just watching. But in the final stages, these hallucinations can turn dark or bizarrely comforting. Did Binod see his family? Did he believe he was back in Kathmandu? Did he think the flapping of the tent fabric was the sound of prayer flags at a temple? One of the most chilling phenomena observed in hypothermia cases, which often goes hand in hand with altitude sicknesses. Paradoxical undressing. As the body's core temperature drops dangerously low, the hypothalamus, the part of the brain that regulates temperature, malfunctions. It creates a sudden, overwhelming sensation of intense heat. The freezing victim feels like they are burning up. In their final moments of delirium, they tear off their gloves, their down suits, their hats. They expose their flesh to the -30-degree wind, believing they are escaping a fire. While we do not have specific autopsy details on whether Binod engaged in this final act, it is a specter that hangs over every death on the mountain. It represents the ultimate betrayal of the body. The very mechanisms designed to keep us alive our senses turn against us, tricking us into accelerating our own demise. The image of a climber, freezing to death, frantically stripping off their clothes in the dark of a tent, is a horror that transcends the physical. It is a psychological unraveling. Furthermore, Binod's status as a Nepali climber adds a complex layer to this moral dilemma. For decades, the narrative of Everest has been Western clients get in trouble. Nepali Sherpas save them. We have seen countless images of heroic Sherpas dragging incapacitated clients down the mountain. But who saves the rescuer? Who saves the local climber? When a Nepali climber falls ill, the dynamic shifts. There is often a subconscious assumption that they are stronger, that they are superhuman in the mountains. This bias can be lethal. It can lead to a delay in intervention. He's a local, he's just tired, he'll be fine. By the time the severity of Binod's condition was fully realized, the window for a rescue which would have required a sled, oxygen, and 6 strong men to drag him down the lot's face had likely slammed shut. The night of May 23rd at Camp 4 was a theater of the macabre. Outside, the wind howled the song of the mountain. Inside the tent, a man was fading. The loneliness of this specific death is distinct. It is not the loneliness of the castaway on a desert island. It is the loneliness of a man in a crowded room where everyone is blind and deaf. He was surrounded by the elite of the climbing world, by millions of dollars worth of gear, by satellite phones and radios. And yet, he was as unreachable as if he were on the dark side of the moon. The moral dilemma leaves us with an uncomfortable reflection on the nature of the climb itself. We glorify the summit, we post the photos on Instagram, we celebrate the conquest, but we rarely discuss the cost of the ticket. The cost is not just the $50,000 permit fee. The cost is the willingness to enter a zone where you agree to leave your humanity at the door. Every climber who clips into the fixed rope at the bottom of the mountain signs an unwritten social contract. If I die alone. If you die, I cannot save you. As the night wore on, Binod's breathing would have changed. The Cheyne-Stokes respiration, a terrifying cycle of rapid, deep breathing, followed by long pauses of apnea, where the person stops breathing. Entirely 4 seconds at a time would have set in. It is the sound of the body's operating system crashing. The pauses get longer, the breaths get shallower. The heart, struggling to pump sludge through constricted veins, begins to misfire. Eventually, the pauses become permanent. The sun rose on May 24th, the wind likely died down, as it often does in the morning. The camp woke up. Climbers unzipped their tents, checked the weather, and prepared for their descent or their summit push. But for Binod Babu Bastakoti, the sun brought no warmth. He had become part of the mountain. He had joined the silent majority of Everest, the permanent residents of the death zone. His death was not a crime. No one murdered him, but he was a victim of the indifferent cruelty of physics and the terrifying limitations of human compassion in the face of survival. He was a man who went to the roof of the world to find glory, and instead found the ultimate solitude. The sun that rose over the Himalayas on the morning of May 24, 2024, illuminated a scene of breathtaking, almost violent beauty. The curvature of the earth was visible against the indigo sky. The peaks of Lhotse and Makalu glowed like forged iron, but inside a tent at Camp 4, amidst the scattering of gear and the remnants of a hard-fought expedition, there was only stillness. Binod Babu Bastakoti had become a permanent part of the landscape he sought to conquer. His journey ended where the atmosphere is too thin to sustain a flame, let alone a human soul. When a tragedy like this occurs in the civilized world, the aftermath is predictable: flashing lights, coroners, funerals, closure. But on Everest, death is administratively and physically different. This brings us to the grim reality that viewers often find hardest to comprehend: the logistics of the high-altitude graveyard. Why is he still there? Why are hundreds of others still there? The answer lies in the brutal calculus of the death zone. A human body, when frozen solid, becomes a leaden weight, often exceeding 300 pounds. To move such a weight from the South Col, down the sheer ice face of the Lhotse Wall, through the traversal of the Yellow Band, and across a shifting, treacherous labyrinth of the Khumbu Ice Fall, is a task that borders on the impossible. It is not a matter of disrespect. It is a matter of mathematics. To retrieve a single body from Camp 4 requires a team of 6 to 10 highly acclimatized Sherpas, working in unison, putting their own lives in extreme jeopardy for every single step of the descent. The ethical equation is cold, but necessary. Is it worth risking the lives of 6 living fathers, brothers, and sons, to retrieve the shell of one man who has already passed? In almost every case, the mountain answers no. And so, Binod likely joins the silent fraternity of the open graveyard. He joins Green Boots, Sleeping Beauty, and the hundreds of nameless others who serve as grim waypoints for future climbers. They are the guardians of the peak, frozen statues that offer a silent warning to everyone who passes. This is what the price of glory looks like. There is a profound melancholic irony in this. In our modern world, we sanitize death. We hide it in hospitals and funeral homes. But on Everest, death is on display. It is raw, unvarnished, and omnipresent. The colorful down suits of the fallen remain bright against the snow for decades, preserved by the dry air and deep freeze. They become landmarks. Turn right at the Blue Boots. Rest near the fallen climber. It is the only place on Earth where we literally step over the dead to chase a dream. Binod's death forces us to look in the mirror and ask uncomfortable questions about the nature of human ambition. What is it that drives us to these places? Is it the view? Is it the accolades? Or is it a desperate need to feel something real in an increasingly artificial world? We live in an age of comfort, of temperature-controlled rooms, and digital safety. Everest represents the antithesis of that. It is the last place where you can die simply by sitting down. The tragedy of Binod Babu Bastakoti is not that he failed. He didn't fail. He succeeded. He achieved the objective. The tragedy is that the definition of success on Everest is often fatally flawed. We are taught that the summit is the goal, but the summit is merely a geographical point. The true goal of mountaineering is the return, the round trip, the ability to tell the story. Binod paid for a ticket that was only valid for one way. His story also highlights the dangerous democratization of the death zone. As technology improves and commercial expeditions become more streamlined, we are lulled into a false sense of security. We believe that if we pay enough money, if we have the best heated socks, and the best oxygen regulators, we can cheat the mountain. But nature does not take bribes. The hypoxia that killed Binod does not care about your net worth, your experience level, or your nationality. It is an indiscriminate biological force. As the 2024 season fades into history, the tents at Camp 4 will be packed up. The oxygen bottles will be cleared away. The climbers will return to their offices in Tokyo, New York, and London. But Binod will remain. He will stay at the South Col, watching the seasons change, watching the monsoon clouds roll in, watching the jet stream strip the snow from the rock. He is now a part of the mountain's eternal memory. We must remember him not just as a statistic or a cautionary tale, but as a man who had the courage to push to the absolute limit of human endurance. He walked the razor's edge between the earth and the sky. He stared into the void, and while the void eventually claimed him, there is a somber dignity in his final resting place. He sleeps in the clouds, in the highest sepulcher on the planet. This story is a heavy one, but it is necessary. It reminds us that we are small, and the world is vast and indifferent to our desires. It teaches us humility. If you value this kind of storytelling narratives that refuse to look away from the hard truths of survival, biology, and the human condition, then please, I urge you to subscribe to Ben's Stories right now. We are building a library of the most compelling, mysterious, and educational stories from the edges of our world, and we want you to be part of this journey. Click the bell icon so you never miss a briefing on the unknown. Before you go, I want to leave you with a question that I've been wrestling with while researching Binod's final hours. It's easy to say what we would do from the comfort of our homes, but try to truly put yourself in that thin air. With the summit just 1 hour away, here is the question. If you were 100 meters from the summit of Everest, having spent your life savings and years of training to get there, but your body whispered that something was wrong, would you have the strength to turn around? Or would the pull of the peak be too strong to resist? Let me know your honest answer in the comments below. Would you choose the glory, or would you choose the descent? Until next time, stay curious and stay safe.